my name is Haley, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys all about an indigenous hooch. So this hooch technically isn't alcoholic, but it is fermented, so that's why we're going to be talking about it today. So our hooch is called pu-erh, and it is a type of tea that comes from China. So in the spirit of things, since we're talking about tea, I am actually going to be brewing some here. So the kind of setup that I've got going on is the traditional Chinese way of brewing tea. It's also called gong fu cha. So it's not quite as fancy as the Japanese tea ceremony, not quite as casual as, a British afternoon tea. It sits somewhere kind of in the middle. Something that's different about this style of brewing tea is that instead of using a teapot, we are actually going to be using something called a gaiwan, which roughly translates to lidded bowl. Sorry about the kettle. So you've got your bowl, you've got the lid. I've already got some tea leaves in here. This is a sticky rice pu-erh. I've got one that's still in its packaging right here. You can see that it's this little ball. And the basic principle of gong fu cha is that you are going to have a relatively little amount of tea leaves. You're going to be brewing them for very short amounts of time. And because you're brewing them for very short amounts of time, you're going to be able to get a lot of steepings out of them. So with a really high quality pu-erh, for example, you can get anywhere from maybe like 10 or sometimes even 20 different steepings out of just one set of tea leaves. So it's a little bit different from, just you're having some Earl Grey at breakfast time and, throwing out the tea bag. So something cool you can see here too is that, so you remember how it was like that hard little ball, that little cake ball? So now it's kind of opened up a little bit. Tea leaves are starting to hang out. So yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing here. Sorry about the kettle. Hopefully it won't be too loud. I have faith in it, although it can be a little bit obnoxious sometimes. So with that out of the way, we are going to be moving on to talking about just a little bit of background about tea itself. So tea is all made from one specific plant, and that plant is called Camellia sinensis. So it doesn't matter whether it's made out of like the leaves, the buds, sometimes even the sticks of that plant. As long as it's made from that plant, it's considered tea. Anything else is not technically a tea. It's called a tisane. So your herbal teas, if it's not made out of the real deal Camellia sinensis, it's not technically a tea. So there are two main subspecies of Camellia sinensis. We've got Camellia sinensis, which is the small leaf variety and the one that is going to be cultivated in most of China. And then you've got Camellia sinensis assamica, which is the big leaf variety. And the big leaf variety thrives in slightly warmer climates that you find in southwestern China and in, India, Tibet, that region. So if tea all comes from one specific plant, why do we have so many different varieties? You've got white teas, green teas, oolongs, black teas, pu-erh. In China there's even this category of tea that's, you've got like yellow tea and red tea as well. So you can get different colors of tea depending on how long you let the tea leaves oxidize for. So you're out in the fields, you're picking the leaves, and as soon as those leaves are picked, they're being exposed to the oxygen in the air. And you get different colors of tea depending on how long you let those leaves oxidize for. So if you were to say pick the leaves and then as soon as you possibly can, you were to steam them, stop the oxidation, you're going to get lighter colors of tea. So like white teas and oolongs tend to have lower levels of oxidation. On the other hand, you've got stuff like black tea and pu-erh, which are maybe like 75% oxidated. So something kind of interesting to note is that a lot of the time when you're looking through tea literature, the word oxidation is sometimes lost in translation and is sometimes translated as fermentation. But that's, those are two completely different processes. So I guess the cool thing is that there actually is a tea that's fermented, but most of them aren't. So pu-erh, what we're talking about today, is the world's only fermented tea, and that's what makes it unique, because it does actually go through a fermentation process. It's kind of a little bit more like a compost just because it is the leaves that are getting fermented, but I'll talk more about that in a little bit. If you're wondering how it tastes a little bit like sticky rice. It's really good. I like this one a lot. So the subspecies of Camellia sinensis that pu-erh is made out of is that Camellia sinensis assamica, so the big leaf one. Again, the one that thrives in that warmer southwestern China climate, specifically in the Yunnan province. And because, that's where that subspecies of tea plant thrives, pu-erh is often considered to be a specialty of the Yunnan province. I think pu-erh is also probably one of the teas that we least know about in the Western world, because we've got, like our Earl Greys and our English breakfasts and all that jazz, and those are all black teas, Everyone's heard of like Japanese green tea and, jasmine with flowers, and like sometimes people have heard of oolong, but unless you or someone you're close to is super into traditional Chinese tea, you've probably never heard of pu-erh, and honestly, that's okay. I'd never heard of pu-erh until I got to know somebody who was super into traditional Chinese tea, but honestly, I think pu-erh is probably one of the most interesting, and again, that's why we're talking about it today. So before I get into some of the kind of nitty-gritty about the different types of pu-erh, first we're going to talk a little bit about just some general history about it, how it came to be. So pu-erh originated like thousands of years ago in ancient China. Specifically as a kind of like a trade commodity. So similarly to the Silk Road, there was also another road that was called the Tea Horse Road. It ran through the mountains in Sichuan and Yunnan, China, and it actually ran into Tibet as well. And it was super important in connecting, those areas in southwestern China to Tibet. One of the main things that road was used for was trading tea from China for horses in Tibet, thus, the Tea Horse Road. Pu-erh actually gets its name because it is named after the town of Pu-erh in China, and that was one of the, stops along the Tea Horse Road where pu-erh was the most often traded in. So pu-erh is also super interesting because it's one of the few teas that is pressed into cakes. So like I showed you before, it started out as this little hard ball of tea. Once I started steeping it, you got loose leaves. It can come in all different kinds of shapes. This is a kind of pu-erh that is actually in an orange peel. So if I were to unwrap this, you'd see there's a little tiny orange peel and the tea leaves are inside that. We've got this pu-erh, which is pressed into a really big brick. It's just a giant block of tea. I've got my hand for comparison. It's about the size of my hand. And you've also got, other fancier shapes. There's like a mushroom shape. This one right here is a melon shape. You can see, it's really pretty. It's got like the nice like little indentations like that. It's a whole thing. But pu-erh is one of, if not the only tea that is packaged like that. Sometimes you find white teas that are pressed into like huge flat cakes, but most of the time it's going to be pu-erh. So part of the reason behind that has to do with pu-erh's origins on the Tea Horse Road. So it's a lot easier to transport tea leaves if they are pressed into this huge cake than if you just have a bunch of loose leaves kind of ambling about. And so, you know, people would press them into cakes. It made them easier to transport. Sorry, give me a second. I thought I could multitask a little bit better than I actually can. Come to the UPST club if you want to learn more about Gong Fu Cha. And so because, you know, you're transporting these tea leaves along, you know, a road that you're winding along on horseback, the tea would actually change along the way. So, you know, it's just, it's sitting there in its little cake, it's naturally aging, and you actually have the natural microbes just around in the environment that started to ferment the leaves over time. And so, you know, by the time the tea got to its destination, it was a little bit different. Not only was it different in color, but the flavor was different. And people thought it was really good. They really liked it. And so, you know, people began seeking it out, like, on purpose. They were like, oh, this is super good. Some of the, you know, like, richer elites in Chinese society back then started, you know, seeking it out due to taste and also due to its proclaimed health benefits. The health benefits of pu-erh is another topic I'll circle back to by the end of this too. So now that we've got a little bit of background about pu-erh, sorry, I just got tea leaves all over my floor. Now that we've gotten to a little bit of background in the history of pu-erh, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit more about the different types of pu-erh. So there are two main types of pu-erh. You have sheng pu-erh, also called ripe pu-erh, which is aged naturally, and then you have shou pu-erh, which is also called ripe pu-erh, and this is a type of pu-erh that is aged artificially. So sheng pu-erh is going to be more like, I guess, the original pu-erh in the days of ancient China. So you make sheng pu-erh, you know, kind of how you make any other tea. You know, you pick your leaves, you dry them, press them into cakes, and then you put them into storage. And so basically they're just kind of allowed to sit in a dark storage and age naturally over time. So, you know, when they dry the leaves, they don't dry them enough to remove all the moisture and to kill all the microbes, so you still got something going on with the leaves. You're putting it away and just kind of allowing them to do their own thing. And so, kind of similarly to wine, sheng pu-erh and all pu-erh gets a lot better with age. You know, the flavors change, the tastes, all that stuff. And so cakes of really, really old sheng pu-erh are very highly prized, and they're super expensive. So not a lot of people have, you know, or at least want to spend all that money to just get one cake of sheng pu-erh. And so I believe it was in the, I think, 1970s, they came up with a way to kind of expedite that whole process, and thus shou pu-erh was born. So shou pu-erh is processed the same way as sheng. You know, the leaves are picked and then they're dried, but shou pu-erh goes through this extra step that's called pile fermentation. So you're basically taking all these dry leaves, putting them into like huge mounds, and then you're putting them into a temperature and humidity controlled environment. And so once your leaves are all piled up, you're basically just kind of spraying down, wetting down the leaves, and creating an environment for the natural microbes to grow in and to thrive. And so because, you know, you're being very careful and very specific about the environment that this pu-erh is fermenting and aging in, the process of pile fermentation very rapidly speeds up the whole process. So, you know, it's going to take maybe a few months to get some pretty solid shou pu-erh versus, you know, waiting years and years to get some nice quality sheng pu-erh. And, you know, like, while the piles are sitting in these, like, very controlled environments, you know, people are tending to them, you know, like, constantly, like, turning them over, making sure they have an even fermentation. And nowadays, sometimes people will actually even inoculate the leaf piles with some of the microbes that are known to ferment in pu-erh, to even further speed up that process. So you're giving it even a further leg up, making it even easier to kind of ferment and compost. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the actual fermentation process. So the fermentation process, again, ends up kind of being a little bit more like a compost, just because, you know, you are having, you're getting all these like wet leaves and putting them in a pile and just kind of letting whatever's in there go ham. But the actual process of it is, you know, you're taking the leaves out off of the trees, and you're drying them in order to inactivate a lot of the enzymes that are activated during oxidation once they're picked. And there are actually quite a few studies done about the main microbes that ferment pu-erh. And a couple of the papers that I found actually cited some of the microbes that ferment pu-erh as some of the ones that help to ferment baijiu. So some of the ones that are in chu, the baijiu starter. So some of the main bacteria that do the fermenting for pu-erh are Aspergillus niger, which is a type of mold. Sorry, I haven't tried to say these names out loud. Blastoporus adenovirans and Pichia, which are both yeasts. Part of the reason that people are super interested in pu-erh fermentation is because pu-erh has gotten a lot more popular over the years. So while it is probably the least known tea in the Western world, it is starting to pick up steam and get a little bit more popular. And you know, as demand goes up, you know, you've got to keep up with the supply. And so, you know, anyone who's everyone is going to try to create their own pu-erh, whether that be sheng or shou, although shou is a lot easier and a lot faster. So because of that, it's really important to know where you're getting your pu-erh from. Kind of similarly to baijiu, there's no regulations on the processing and, you know, making of pu-erh. So there is a lot of bad pu-erh out there that can actually make you feel sick if you drink it over long periods of time. So it's very important to make sure you know who you're buying from and to make sure you're buying from a very credible seller, someone who actually knows what they're doing, because otherwise it's going to be some bad news. But there are a lot of like tips and tricks out there, you know, to tell whether you have bad pu-erh or not. I always think one of the funniest ones to me is that if your tea smells like fish, it's probably not the highest quality. So again, because you've got a tea that is fermented, and you know, a lot of kind of sketchy sellers out there, and not a lot of people who really know about the impacts of pu-erh on health, you know, that's something that is pretty highly studied. So I'm gonna, I guess, kind of transition into talking about some of the, you know, health impacts, whether those be beneficial or not. I'm not sure, but yeah. Tea has been used for its medicinal properties for, you know, again, hundreds of thousands of years since, you know, ancient China. Something that's, I guess, kind of culturally interesting to note is that one of the main reasons that the Chinese tend to drink their tea after meals is, you know, because it was said to aid with digestion. And so, again, like all tea, pu-erh is also, you know, highly valued and desired because of these, you know, supposed medicinal benefits. So one of the reasons that pu-erh specifically is said to have health benefits is because of these compounds in tea called polyphenols. And these are compounds that are supposedly antioxidants, you know, free radicals and all that jazz. And so because of that, you know, tea is supposed to be really good for you. And specifically in pu-erh, one of the main compounds you'll get is this compound called theobromine, and they are produced during the natural fermentation process. When microbes break down polyphenols, they break down into theobronines, among other things. So theobronines are part of what give pu-erh its color when you're steeping it. I would show you, but I don't want to spill it everywhere. It's a very nice, like, chocolatey, kind of rich caramel, dark brown color, almost a really deep red. And supposedly these theobronines also have very strong antioxidant properties. Another, I guess, one of the potential impacts of pu-erh on health is, again, due to the fact that it is fermented. So something that's kind of specific to Chinese tea culture, and again, very specifically pu-erh, is the concept of rinsing your tea leaves. So it does kind of have like the deeper like philosophical connection of, you're just like going over your tea leaves once with hot water, just to kind of wake the tea leaves up. But with pu-erh, this step is absolutely necessary. It's called a rinse or a wash, and you are basically taking your hot water, dumping it over the pu-erh, letting it sit for maybe 20 seconds, and then immediately dumping it back out. If you remember back at the very beginning of the video when I was first steeping the pu-erh, I did this. You might not have noticed it because I didn't explain it, but it's there, I promise. Yeah, so with pu-erh, you absolutely have to rinse your tea leaves. So this is because it is fermented, and hypothetically by washing or rinsing your pu-erh, you're supposed to be rinsing out any impurities or any of the bad stuff that is a byproduct of fermentation. So this is kind of, I guess, not really backed up by any huge science. I feel like it was kind of just something that has been so strongly perpetuated over time that it's, not something that anybody's really willing to stop doing because, why would they? And a lot of the papers at the end, they're like, hey, we still recommend rinsing your pu-erh leaves just because nobody knows. So a lot of people are still out there researching whether pu-erh is actually beneficial or detrimental to people's health. And one of the other important things to note is that people still aren't really sure if it's, the microbes themselves in the pu-erh that are going to cause negative health impacts, or, the compounds that these microbes produce during fermentation. So yeah, there you have it. The world's only fermented tea. It's super cool. It's got a deep history. The science behind it is super interesting. If you ever want to try some, stop by the UPS Tea Club.